All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this official side event at the Summit of the Future Action Days, focusing on a very key topic, at least a topic that we're all passionate about that are here today, I hope. It's about amplifying a youth perspective on measuring what we value. My name is Özge Aydoğan. I'm the director of the Beyond Lab. The Beyond Lab is a social innovation space for long-term sustainability at the Office of the Director General at the UN in Geneva. I will be your moderator today. So if there's anything, please ping me up. You can always come to me. Why are we organizing this discussion? Because I think there's an overall sense that there's an urgency, of course, to move beyond GDP as a key measure to align how we measure progress along planetary and human values. But when we do that, when we go on and about rethinking economic systems, there's oftentimes a lack, or at least even to a certain extent, I would argue, an exclusion of youth voices, although they are the ones who are going to be impacted by the economic system that we have today. So that's why at the lab, in partnership with UNCTAD and Development, Giovanni Valencisi is here from there, our partner, and also Lawrence from Rethinking Economics International. We have Kickstart initiative on youth moving beyond GDP. As part of that, there has been, and you can see that as well as follow-up, happy to share, and on the websites of our respective organizations, a youth essay competition where we ask exactly this question: how can we measure what we value? This happened in April this year. We got over 600 responses, and now I would like to continue this conversation at the Summit of the Future. As you also know or might know, moving beyond GDP will be a key, although a small aspect of the path for the future. So under Action 48, there's now language on that, which says we will develop a framework to move beyond GDP that complements actually GDP. So how can we do that? This is the core, and just to wrap up the small introduction from my side, the agenda for today will be as follows. We will have a framing session, setting the stage session at the very beginning. Then we will move on into the actual core of the event, which is an intergenerational dialogue between youth experts and policymakers today from Spain and from Zambia. And then you'll have the opportunity to engage with the speakers in an open discussion around 20 minutes. And then Lawrence will be wrapping up the discussion from Rethinking Economics. So any further ado, I would actually like to introduce our first speaker to set the scene and the house on fire, as you would like to say, which is Kumi Naidu. Thank you so much, Kumi. I know that you were traveling, so thank you for making time for this. Kumi has been and is still obviously a human rights and environmental justice activist for a very long time, refusing to normalize, as he says, inequality and devoting himself to exposing injustice, including in the former apartheid movement, anti-apartheid movement, in South Africa. He is currently a distinguished lecturer at Stanford University, the former Secretary General of Amnesty International. Also, he has been leading Greenpeace International as the first person from the Global South in the past. Kumi, over to you. How can we move GDP? Why do we need that? And what's your point on that? Thank you.
Hi, greetings everyone. Do you hear me okay? Do you see my presentation? So let me just say that these days I am more nervous speaking to any group because when I was speaking at a meeting recently, one of the delegates put up their hands and said, "Mr. Naidu, have you heard of Martin Luther King?" And I said, "Yes, I did." And she said, "Do you know what his most famous speech was called?" I said, "I have a dream." And then she shouted back at me saying, "Oh, but when we hear you speak, it sounds like you have a nightmare. The oceans are rising, the forests are disappearing, the inequality is rising," and so on. So let me start by making that point, that one of the big challenges we find is how can we speak truth to power on the one hand, not sanitize how deeply broken our economic system and intersecting systems are, but also do it in a way that does not disempower, demotivate, immobilize, and so on. So the question before us, which is how can we move beyond GDP, is one of the most critical questions of our time. For far too long, gross domestic product has been the predominant yardstick of progress. While it provides a snapshot of economic activity, it falls dramatically short of the full picture of human well-being. GDP doesn't account for a mother who can breathe clean air while watching her children play, nor does it measure the happiness of a community that thrives harmoniously with nature. GDP is a blind to the rich tapestry of the human experience and ignores its complexity. So when we measure GDP today, if you chop down a forest, it's a tick, a positive thing on GDP, even though chopping down a forest is taking us closer and closer to climate catastrophe. Oops, getting a bit worried about my, okay. So, but the universe and our global environment is teaching us things all the time. So in 1997, there was the Asian financial crisis. In 2008, 2009, there was a global financial crisis. And then we had COVID. And all of these crises showed us that our economic system is broken and doesn't take care of the majority of our people on this planet. And what do you see as the approach of those in power? The approach of those in power is always, during the crisis, they talk about Build Back Better, for example. Remember? Who talks about Build Back Better now? During COVID, everybody was saying Build Back Better. And during those conversations, it said we need to address how we measure wealth. Okay? So the approach generally, though, is everything you see on the left-hand side of the screen. It's all about system recovery, system protection, and system maintenance. And what I want to urge all of us here today is to recognize that the moment of history that we find ourselves in is one that demands us to be about system innovation, system transformation, and system redesign. We have to commit to creative maladjustment, that is not accepting the status quo. Martin Luther King, speaking in 1965, said, we should refuse to adjust to an economic condition that will take necessities from the many and give luxuries to the few when millions of God's children are smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in an affluent society. If that was relevant in 1965, that is now 1,000 times more relevant, both in the US and elsewhere. And so he went on to say that we should set up a new international organization that wasn't set up, and maybe it's time for you folks here to lead that, which he called the International Association for the Advancement of Creative Maladjustment. That is, people who refuse to adjust to a broken status quo. And the problem is, all our institutions, from the higher echelons of the United Nations to our corporate world, to our governmental world, we have accepted a broken status quo. And therefore, we don't embrace the wisdom that Albert Einstein shared with us some decades ago when he said, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting to get different results. And we are caught in that trap. So therefore, this conversation today is probably one of the most important conversations happening during the UN General Assembly. And I don't say that just to make you feel good about this event. If we do not go to asking what are the root causes of how we find ourselves in the situation that we are, we don't stand a chance to turn things around. So amongst the things we need to do is we really need to turbocharge intersectionality. We need to recognize that GDP is not just simply gross domestic profit, it's a gross domestic problem. And we need to understand the politics behind what is in effect the world's most powerful number. And we need to be clear, it's not as if there are not other ways of seeing how we can measure and value human experience. This work, as you know, is from Bhutan, which is known as the Gross National Happiness Index. And you can see, yeah, when you look at those 8 or so elements of it, it goes way beyond simply standards of living, which GDP tends to revolve around. And I want to conclude then by saying, to all of you. If you are anything like me, then there are days right now which are really, really difficult. When we look at what's happening in the world, we see genocide, we see the rise of fascism, we see deepening inequality, and so on. So I want to end by saying that the challenge for all of us right now is to recognize that all people around the world have power. And the challenge for us as leaders is to help release that power. And you should read the diagram on your screen, starting from the center, where we say people have power as litigators, as voters and citizens, and it's organized in 4 quadrants. I don't have time to take you into the detail of it. But we have to offer people multiple ways in which they can participate and contribute to society. And in doing that, I want to conclude with this, to say to you that the moment of history that we find ourselves in is one in which pessimism is a luxury we simply cannot afford. And the pessimism that justifiably emerges from our analysis, our observation, and our lived experiences can, must, and should be responded to by the optimism of our action, our thought, our courage, and our love for humanity. And this conversation, finally, on the GDP is a no-brainer. The GDP has only worked for a very narrow, privileged strata of society at the top. It is time now that we develop a way of valuing wealth and well-being in a way where we build a system of measurement which values everybody on this planet. Thank you very much for allowing me to contribute to your very, very important conversation.
Thank you so much, Kumi. And I've taken notes of so many things that you have said. I think that resonate with us, and that's exactly why we are organizing this event today. Indeed, I think the word that you shared at the end, that we inherit the world not from our, from the people that came before us, but we're actually borrowing it from those that are ahead of us. It's such a key, it's such a key wisdom, I think, connecting. Also, I would say when we talk about how can we look forward, that one part of looking forward is also connecting what the past has taught us in terms of indigenous, I think, thinking and wisdom. So thank you for that. And also your point, and this is a good segue into Giovanni, systems change, not systems reform, right? Imagination and not stagnation, and dare to be different, dare to actually change. And Giovanni, I know at the UN, this has taken a long time for this conversation to arrive, although a lot of maybe, backdoors exchanges have been happening, but for this to be finally on the agenda at the Summit of the Future, although, Kumi, to come back to you, it's a key topic, but there is one little section, I mentioned that maybe before, Action 48 in the famous Pact for the Future that is supposed to be adopted, that speaks about the need to go beyond GDP. But nevertheless, the text is there. It can be a small hole in the wall that can be a powerful big door, I think, for the rest to come in. So Giovanni, from your experience, how do you see the way going forwards? Explaining a bit, the dialogue that you have been sort of part of within the framework that you are of the United Nations, the processes that you are maybe part of, the processes that are happening, but also those to sort of come, if that makes sense. And before I give you the word, I wanted to introduce you as well. I did mention already that you work at UN Trade and Development, but also just to say I've met Giovanni. Giovanni is a very passionate economist that is right there where you need to be, looking into ways of changing the system so that it's aligned for people and planet. So Giovanni, over to you.
Thank you very much, Özge. And it's always difficult to speak after such an inspiring speaker like Kumi, but I'll try to make perhaps 3 points here. The first one is, like you said, situate this discussion in the broader process. So we know that there have been criticism on GDP since a long time, and they're not new. In fact, even some of the proponents of GDP, like Kuznets, were very early observing that the welfare of a nation can scarcely be inferred. from a measure like GDP. But if we move on, there have been other waves of criticism, and I think for this discussion it's particularly important to think of the Brundtland report in the 80s, which defined sustainability as an intergenerational issue, so the capacity of satisfy one's needs while preserving the ability of future generation to do the same. And then there has been, for instance, another notable element of criticism, the Sen-Stiglitz and Fitoussi Commission, which was very strong in emphasizing the need to decouple welfare and well-being measures from GDP as such. Now, all that conversation led to the SDGs, and in SDG 17.19, there is mention of the need to develop measurements of progress that complement progress towards sustainable development that complement GDP. Within the UN system, that has led to a process that was led by the Chief Executive Board within the UN system and co-chaired by 3 institutions that deal with these issues, namely UNDESA, UNCTAD, and UNDP, which produced a series of papers that then led to one of the policy briefs prepared by the Secretary General for the Summit of the Future. And going forward, what we are expecting is that there will soon be the appointment of a high-level expert committee that will draw recommendation towards the identification of a set of metrics that will feed into a sort of dashboard that should more adequately value what we care. So provide a set of metrics, not just one metrics, to capture all or a sufficient set of dimensions of well-being. Now, I think the second point I would like to make is highlighting why this conversation is important. And I think there are 3 elements to that. The first one is that it is clear since decades, I would say, that GDP has the important blind spots, and these are becoming more and more important. One is, of course, capturing the activities of multinational companies, for instance, and allocating that in the correct way across economies. Another very important one that has to do a lot with also the development process is the extent of informality, self-consumption, and so on. And third, the extent of unpaid work. Of course, to the extent, insofar as GDP cannot adequately capture these dimensions, it can also lead to misleading conclusions on, for example, gender inequalities, intergenerational inequalities, equality of opportunities, and so on. Equally important, GDP presents some challenges when articulating to the social and the environmental elements of sustainable development. You can think of the externality and the fact that if you don't have a price for certain negative environmental effects, they won't be captured into GDP. And CO2 emissions are a very clear example of that. But you could also think about the increase in inequality in most countries, which can hardly be distilled into a single figure for GDP per capita, whether you take the average or you take the median. Obviously, it won't provide enough information to capture the extent of functional inequality between wage share and profit share, or gender inequalities, and so on and so forth. But I think perhaps the most important issue with GDP is that, as Nadu rightly said, it's an inadequate measure to capture well-being, and therefore it should not be considered as a sort of objective function that policy making should maximize, because that will lead you astray from a broader notion of prosperity and equality. And yet, there are many developing countries and developed countries where a lot of the political discussion focuses on GDP. and, for example, adopt as a goalpost reaching a certain level of income, middle income status, high income status, and so on and so forth. Now, to conclude, let me go to the third point, which is, in my view, why it's important to get the youth involved in this conversation. I think both you and Kumi made very important points related to the intergenerational aspect of this debate and the importance of it. I would add to that two things. First of all, coming to a concrete and sufficiently broad dashboard of indicators will require, on the one end, a very strong capacity development efforts in terms of statistical capacities in a number of countries, but also innovation in terms of what data we can harness to measure what we really care. And in both dimensions, of course, the youth has an important role to play. And third, I would say, in order to change not just the narrative, but also the action, I think it is inevitable that we will have to go through a series of experimentation and actions on the ground to test different approaches to how to value other elements that may not be captured by a crude economic lens, so to speak. And again, the contribution of the youth cannot but be critical in this direction. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Giovanni. I couldn't agree more. And again, thank you for being honest and sharing your, I know, UN, but also personal thoughts on this. And I would maybe add one point, again, building on what I said before, also thinking that the future that we're creating will be much more impacting young people than those that are creating it, if that makes sense. So we have to make sure that they become part of the designing of the system, redesigning of the system that also Kumi alluded to at the beginning. So how can we do that best? I think that's a very fantastic segue actually into now the intergenerational discussion, where I would like to introduce four new speakers. Rose Holm, who is one of our winners of the essay competition that I mentioned at the beginning of the event. From Denmark, Rose holds an MSc in Global Studies and International Development Studies. Hi, Rose. Thanks for being here with us today. Then Felix Vincente, who's also one of the winners of the essay competition on Moving Beyond GDP and Measuring What We Value from Argentina. He's an MA student in economics. Hi, Felix. Then from the member state side, from the national side, that was emphasized the need to do something on that, obviously, in the way how we look at GDP and measure GDP nationally speaking. We have Paula Fernandez-Wolf, who is the Director General for the 2030 Agenda at the Ministry of Social Rights, Consumer Affairs and 2030 Agenda of Spain. Actually, Paula, like many of us today on the call, is also a human rights activist and lawyer who specializes on socioeconomic rights and poverty and inequality. And she has been previously working with Olivier de Schutter. I'm sure to many of you, he is a very known name, the special advisor and rapporteur on extreme poverty and human rights in the UN, has working very much on pushing this agenda forward. Thank you, Paula, for being with us today. And then Cholwe Mulenga Chikolva, who is a very seasoned diplomat, but also a very dear friend of the Beyond Lab. Cholwe is a very passionate change maker. She's worked on integrating the perspectives of young people and diversity overall in the work she does. She currently serves as a first secretary Political Affairs and Administration at the Permanent Mission of the Republic of Zambia at the UN Office and other international organizations in Geneva, as well as in Vienna. Voila, that's our panel for the discussion. And I would like to actually kick off this discussion by looking at Rose. Hi again, Rose. And then also Felix.
Hi.
As we heard, the Pact for the Future, which will be adopted hopefully at the summit, reaffirms the urgency of going beyond GDP. Under Action 48, it was mentioned that there is a demand for developing a framework on measures of progress on sustainable development to complement GDP. So for that, and as Giovanni highlighted, an independent high-level expert group will be formed, is going to be formed, as well as a UN-led intergovernmental process on alternative measures of progress is going to be launched. Now, building what you have shared, Rose, in your essay, but also what you're going to share now with us, which values do you think and principles and priorities should be now reflected in such a framework that can complement and go beyond GDP? What aspect should it include? What aspect maybe it shouldn't include? So we would love to hear from you.
Yes, thank you. And thank you so much for having me. And thank you to Giovanni and Kumi for really inspiring speeches. I think it was really nice to hear. And I resonated so much with what you said. What values should it include? I think for me, one of the most important things in this agenda, in pushing this agenda forward, is that we understand that this is not just about finding new metrics. From what I've looked at all these metrics, a lot of them, like the cause of the way that we've driven GDP forward is not just something that's a part of our economic system, it's also part of our cultural narrative of what it means to live good lives. There is a logic of expansion and increasing resources indefinitely. That is also, I think, from what a lot of the alternative metrics, even though they focus on other types of resources and they expand the level of resources we need to be looking at to education, to health, to many important aspects, I think my biggest fear is that they don't talk about levels of sufficiency, that it still becomes about constant expansion in other ways. And I think it's very important that we reckon with that we also need to think about the good life as something else than expanding our resources constantly, because that will lead us the same direction. Even if we measure a lot of different things, it will keep being something that especially countries in the global north can use to keep advocating for growing their levels of resources. It's a very positive way of spinning the agenda, but I think it fails to meet the needs that we have, which is actually that a lot of us in the global north, myself included from Denmark, we need to reckon with that we need to establish a good life in a different way. That doesn't mean that we can keep hawking more resources from the planet or more economic value. We need to downscale some of our production. I think these are the tough conversations that I think is really important to have in this agenda. That it's not just about increasing what we measure and growing a lot of other things. We need also to have the tough conversations that there are a lot of sectors in our society that we urgently and dramatically need to downscale so that others can have a right to some of those resources, because we are hogging a extensive amount. And in all this new kind of this green growth narrative of technological development, for example, with AI, I've been discovering recently, of course, it is fantastic in many ways, but it also creates an enormous energy need. And for people who use it for their daily jobs of emails and prompting and all these things that are not necessary, like we end up creating so much new things that need to take energy away from more basic needs that other people need. So we need to talk about what things in our society needs to grow and what doesn't need to grow. And I think that's democratic conversation that we need to also have when pushing this agenda. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rose. It's very interesting your point on mindset shift, right? As a key component, narrative shift in changing the system. Because oftentimes I feel there's a focus on the tools, on the mechanics, but indeed what we need to do first and foremost is actually change the narrative. I appreciate you saying that. And again, rethinking what is a good life too. That brings me to Felix. Felix, I also would love to hear from you, again, building on the ideas that you already shared in your essay. And please, for those who are on the call, go and read those essays. They're very inspiring. You can find them on our website and also on the website of Rethinking Economics. Felix, how would you go about this question?
Well, actually, thank you all. Thank you for the organizers for this unique opportunity. I totally agree with this systemic approach that Rose mentioned before. I mean, I think there's a concept, right? Like common but differentiated responsibilities. It's a principle that was, I think it was formalized in Rio de Janeiro in a UN convention in 1992. You know, I belong to the Global South. My region is the most unequal region in the world. And of course, we want all these changes, but, you know, like, who is financing the transition to green energy? You know, like, can we transition while we have to pay huge amounts of money, for example, to the IMF, in my case, in Argentina, but also in Ecuador, in El Salvador, in Egypt? We are facing an economic crisis, for example, in my region. We have many threats to democracy as well. So we have some political parties that don't recognize democracy as an important value. I think the answer is no. With these levels of debt, poverty, and political instability, we cannot invest in our future. So that's why I think it's necessary to address these uncomfortable questions that Rose asked before, in order to have you know, powerful answers. So yeah, it's like common, because we all have responsibilities on making this future, but differentiated responsibilities. It's not the same. We are not in the Global South in a situation where we can invest as much as many other countries can in the developed world. So I think in terms of values, of framework to address these discussions and to go beyond metrics, I think we should be taking care and adopting this kind of framework in order to have a better conversation.
Thank you, Felix. I mean, I think it's interesting the point you're making also in terms of, you know, when we talk about, for example, debt, right? Because GDP, depending on how you put it, it does create also, and we talked about this also, I remember, an extraordinary amount of debt, which is funding that is missing to actually invest in things that create actual value for society and for the planet. And looking at that from a financing perspective is perhaps also quite narrow. So I appreciate you saying that. I want to quickly stay with you too, and then before I hand over to Paula and also Chalwe. Now, since we are in the moment of the Summit of the Future, I just wanted to hear from you, Felix. Do you have expectations, if at all? Do you think there is a moment indeed? What would you like to see from a process like the one, like the Summit of the Future and also the Pact? And if you have no expectations, then you can also be very honest and say, you know what, this is just a summit like any other summit, and this is what we need to do.
Well, actually, I do have expectations, because there's no other way to live this world with that is so unfair, as we mentioned before. I think that maybe if I'm skeptical, because you asked me to be honest, I know that countries that have more responsibility, maybe for them it's not easy, you know, to have a sort of degrowth, or to invest in green energy in countries like mine. For example, we have in South America a lot of natural resources in terms of oil and gas, and well, it's difficult for us to transition to green energy in this situation. So, like, why developed countries would be interested in, for example, producing less and investing more in countries like from the Global South? So that's maybe why I'm skeptical, but at the same time, I think we have a unique opportunity since the world is facing a huge crisis. So maybe people from the world can realize even more nowadays the necessity of doing this.
Thank you, Felix. I hope so too. And maybe on this hopeful message, once back to Rose, just to hear from you and your point on expectations, yes or no?
Yes, I would love
Or
to
in the
say that
middle.
I have expectations. I think my expectations are low, but I really hope that it's true what you said, that we are, by having this small text that we talk about it, that it is a a little door that we can kick in and we can build something. I think that's true. That's how progress usually happens, by small steps. But I think and I think this is a general challenge for the UN at this moment in time, especially with what's happening in the world, with the genocide going on and with a lot of other crises, that they are not managing. From a young person, I feel very frustrated by seeing the inability of them to actually, what it feels like, do something about some of these things. So I think there's a big challenge in them holding their legitimacy if they don't come with more binding agreements or more stronger. Because I read the Pact of the Future, and it just feels like things I've read 10 times before. But I know that it is progress. I think more I know that, of course, we are going to get somewhere. So I want to be hopeful, but I would say it's difficult. I hope that we will see I hope maybe not in the pact, but in the background, that there will be a lot of conversations and people will start to have, even if I can't see it on what they put forward. I'm sure that just the fact that we're here today and we're talking about it makes me very hopeful. And I'm guessing a lot of those conversations are going to happen so that we'll move forward.
Thank you, Rose. Appreciate saying that, and also your pragmatism on this. I mean, I think change also happens through community building and building a movement. So that's hopefully also what we are part of. And on that note, I would like to hand over to Paula. Paula, from Spain. Now you heard from Rose and also Felix, and I'm sure from many others actually, beyond this conversation today, about what could be, should be, possibly reflected. Now, how do you think can those perspectives be indeed better and more systematically integrated into policymaking processes concerning measurement and development? I mean, I know in Spain you're moving ahead and moving forward this agenda, so to speak. And and it would be amazing if you could share a bit from that perspective. But also, I would say, if you have, of course, if you would like to, from your previous experience, also moving this agenda forward into sort of more intergovernmental, multilateral dimension. Paula, over to you.
Thank you, Özge, and I'm so grateful to the Beyond Lab for this invitation. When I received it, I was over the moon and jumped at the opportunity, and thank you for creating this space of dialogue. I was actually going to ask you if I could also get the question on expectations on the Pact for the Future, because I think
you can, of course you can.
From the part of member states, I think we all also have expectations. I think the first thing I would like to say is that Spain, as you all know, is a country from the global north, which means that our needs with regards to GDP growth and the organization of our economy is fundamentally different from the needs of the global south. And I think that principle that Felix referred to, common but differentiated responsibilities, is incredibly important when framing these discussions. And also to say that I would agree with Rose that a lot of the language of the pact is repetitive from previous commitments, and actually the language that it includes on moving beyond GDP was already there in the political declaration of the SDG summit from last September, almost exactly the same, and that is why in the pact it says we reaffirm, because it just takes that language from that declaration. But for example, the creation of this panel of experts is a novelty, and that is something that I think we're all very much looking forward to. But one of the, I would say there are a number of areas where you can find some novel language. This is very, very with a lot of asterisks, but I would say perhaps three main areas. The first one on the Security Council, which is a separate discussion, but the two other ones that are very relevant to this conversation is the reform of the international financial architecture. Also includes what I would call is language that perhaps not as ambitious as I think those of us in this conversation would like, but nonetheless, it does include new language. And we hope that that is a step in the direction of at least what will be discussed at the Financing for Development conference that will take place in Spain next year. So we hope that is a step in the right direction towards that conference. And the third area of novel language, I would say, is that on future generations, because of the declaration on future generations. Now, we could also discuss the content of that declaration, and also I'm sure in this space there will be criticisms to that declaration. But nonetheless, it is an important it is important to provide visibility to the intergenerational impacts of the economic system in particular. So I guess that maybe I'll leave it at this. I have more things to say, but just to answer your question, I would say there are new opportunities opening up for young people. We just need to, I think, first on the side of young people, I think you also need to push us in governments to not just participate in the definition of new measurements, but also adapt and rethink our policymaking processes with your needs in mind. So it's not just about the outcome, but also the processes that we take into account. And from our perspectives, the opposite is true as well. I think rethinking the kinds of consultations that we have, the kinds of outcome documents that we have, the kinds of discussions, etc. I think that's incredibly important. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Paula. Thank you so much. I think the point you're making on the financing obviously is incredibly important. I think it's the broader narrative is indeed right, rethinking economic systems, measuring what we value, but then also financing what we value. Once you measure, how then you finance? I think these two things obviously go hand in hand, and I very much look forward to that piece being connected to the Financing for Development conference in Spain. And the second point you also made about the future generations, indeed, I think that's the part that if you don't provide, a voice, then it's very hard to create that accountability, Felix, that you were also talking about before, right? And that's indeed something that is extremely important. And maybe a last point, which brings me also to Chawe, is having these conversations is good, but how can we institutionalize them as well, right? I think you did both mention, Giovanni and Paula, the point on this expert group. I mean, one idea could be, for instance, that there is a young, people's sounding board, for instance, that can, work together with these experts, or there is an expert that represents that voice. But I think it's important that we do institutionalize these things, Paula, in the sense of policy making. Coming to you, Chawe, I know you're a big promoter of this in your capacity as a Zambian representative. I would like just to hear from you, maybe actually very similarly to Paula, how would you see a possibility to integrate this more systematically into policy making? I mean, if you have experience, you can also share from Zambia, because Paula did, emphasize the perspective from the north. I mean, your perspective from the south. And yeah, I leave it there, and then I will come back with another question. So you're not off the hook yet.
Okay, thank you very much. Firstly, I would like to express my gratitude to Beyond Lab, the UN Trade and Development and Rethinking Economics, for inviting me to participate in this collaborative intergenerational discussion, which is very important. And we're talking about a very important subject at a very critical time, especially in view of the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as other issues that have been happening. And also to congratulate Rose and Felix for winning the essay on Beyond GDP. So I read something something that really caught my eye on the Summit of the Future page, and it said, youth are key participants in efforts to secure breakthroughs in global cooperation. Youth challenge conventional thinking, hold leaders to account, and are focused on generations that come after. Youth stand to lose if leaders fail to fulfill their promises. And I was just like, wow, this is exactly what we need. So the question is, what does integrating youth perspective in a systematic and integrated manner into policy making look like in terms of the discussions around Beyond GDP? So the first thing is care. What exactly does care entail? It's caring about young people. about what they think, what are their projections for themselves as well as for the future generations. So basically, young people should be placed at the center of deliberations and negotiations. They should be physically present in the rooms when we're having discussions. And I'm so happy that we have young people right now, and it's an intergenerational dialogue, and we're sharing perspectives. So this is one of the meaningful ways of participating with the youths. So when you're talking about incorporating their perspectives into policy-making processes concerning economic measurements and development beyond that, I came up with 3 issues because I kept on thinking about this. Firstly, listening. Secondly, learning from young people and learning with young people. So what exactly does this look like? When we talk about listening, it's about getting their views. How do they view the concept of going beyond GDP? What are their views on measuring prosperity, well-being, environmental sustainability? What do they envision as complementary measures beyond GDP? What does that look like? When we talk about learning, it's harvesting their views. I think you're doing well. This is very novel in terms of what Beyond Lab is doing. So harvesting their views and perspectives by building systems and mechanisms, that needs to be deliberate. How can we have their views and build systems? So have them if they share their views, we make sure that we harvest them. We have them in a policy document. We integrate their views. So this can be done. It should be at national, regional, global decision-making platforms. And I think we're already doing that. Learning with them. We have to form formidable collaborations with the youths on how to operationalize the views that we have harvested. So we need to have open dialogue. So open dialogue would effectively improve open dialogue would improve the effectiveness of public policies and strengthen democratic institutions. There's a whole lot of issues happening right now when we look at the youths and what's happening in terms of if countries are facing maybe economic situations, we see maybe an uprising or youths, protesting. So basically, how do we ensure that we listen to their views? So I can give some examples from the Zambian perspective. In March 2024, we had a National Youth Indaba, and this was officiated by our president, His Excellency, Mr. Hakainde Hichilema. So we had cabinet ministers, we had various business leaders who engaged with over 3,000 youths. So you can imagine the president, cabinet ministers, and other business leaders sitting with youths, having real-time conversations on various opportunities of the industry. So, and then another opportunity as well was the constitution review process in 2012, which I was also part of, and I volunteered to do that. So we had youth representatives from 10 provinces who came in to share their views on the constitution review process. And this is very key. After we had that, we consolidated a report, and of course their views were taken on board. And that also, the constitution, we all know, is the supreme document of any nation. So it also entails what kind of policies will then be formulated after you've reviewed your constitution. It also talks about laws that are legally binding. So this is one of the ways that we can make sure that we're integrating deliberately and systematically integrating the perspectives of young people. Then at the regional level, in August 2023, we had an inaugural African Continental Free Trade Area Symposium. And this was held in Lusaka as well. So it facilitated real-time interactions. We had the Secretary General of the AFCFTA who had discussions with the youths. And this was basically on trade issues. So these are some of the ways that youths can be engaged. I think it's very, very important, because if we leave them behind, I mean, we're talking about leaving no one behind. So we have to take in view their considerations. Otherwise, we won't make any progress, especially when you talk about issues of well-being. And this is a very big issue when you look at the discussions that we're having around mental health. Mental health borders on so many issues that really, really touch issues of progress. well-being. If you talk about environmental sustainability, if I'm living in a place where we have an extractive industry and I'm getting affected, those are some of the issues that we can talk about. So the youths are very important in every discussion that we have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joe. And also thank you, really for highlighting this connection. Also, I think Kumi made that right in terms of we cannot be well if the system is unwell. And I think the system making us also be unwell. And I think that is, the also whole human aspect to this dimension. We're running a little bit behind of time. So I have another question to you and Paula. I would really like to hear a lot from you, but given the time constraint, if you can maybe just limit yourself to 2 minutes, if that's okay. And honestly, you already spoke about that quite a bit, but being just a little bit more specific. Paula, you did mention that Spain as a country from the north is, of course, or the economy, let's put it that way, is very much at this point in time organized around beyond GDP, not beyond GDP, that's the vision, but on GDP, exactly. But I'm sure you can see ways how going beyond GDP can also benefit your economy. And I wanted to ask you, what your point on that is and what type of opportunities, of course, also challenges you might see, and also maybe some trade-offs that policies and decision makers have to face and consider when doing that. Because I think the demand and the ask is clear from at least today's youth perspective. We need to move beyond. Paula.
Thank you. I think if we had at least 2 hours, maybe I could answer your question, but in 2 minutes.
Sorry for that. Yes.
I would say I would echo something that Rose, I think, mentioned earlier. GDP as an economic measurement is the problems behind it is a symptom, and I think Kumi also mentioned something along these lines. It is not the root problem, right? The root problem is an economic system that reproduces inequalities, that destroys the environment, that encourages unsustainable levels of consumption, and that relies on extractive forms of production. That is the root problem. Now, over time, I think we've realized that we need to change. We don't have the power to change root problems. Sometimes all we can do is tackle the symptoms, and measuring the way we measure the economy is one of such symptoms. And so from that perspective, I think there are opportunities both at the discursive level. And I think, for example, making sure that we integrate human rights, language, principles, commitments, and obligations into economic policy thinking is one of such opportunities. I think at I guess continuing on a discourse level, making sure that we highlight the need to bring that we bring to the fore the question of well-being as a really a key principle that should really be at the core of all discussions related to economic policy. But I think at the policy level, in terms of concrete reforms, I think, for example, this panel that we talked about is a great, I think, a great opportunity. In a way, it comes in late because, as you might know, the system of national accounts is going to be revised already in 2025. And so ideally, that panel of experts would have been set up before this process. It was already almost, at least, about to finish the consultations feeding into it. But then, in addition to that, I would say also more holistic ways of thinking, and there are specific tools that we can rely on, such as policy coherence for sustainable development, which is also it's a technical process. It can be thought about in two different ways: discursively as the need to be coherent across different parts of the government, but also at a technical level, it includes specific tools that the OECD has developed, and that as policymakers we try to rely on because of obviously the expertise of the organization, but also the kinds of discussions that it can lead to within the government in terms of ensuring there are impact assessments, including intergenerational impact assessments, that I'm aware of. There might not be specific methodologies developed yet, but I am looking more into that, or normative alignment with either with the 2030 agenda or at least with sustainable development as such. etc. I could keep going, but very brief sort of challenges and opportunities that I see going forward.
Thank you so much, Paula. And I think you have given us already food for thought for next follow-up conversation. So we'll be in touch on that one. And very quickly to Chalwe as well. Chalwe, from your perspective, maybe from an African perspective as well, from a Zambian perspective, where do you see opportunities of moving beyond GDP?
I think there are so many opportunities, especially at the country level. Firstly, I think what we really need to do is to make sure that as policymakers, we buy into the beyond GDP agenda. We need to buy into that vision. Otherwise, we won't even be able to implement anything. Also, I think the previous speaker had already mentioned about the creation of intergenerational collaborative spaces. This is very important because we all know we have been making policies based on the outcomes of the measurements of GDP. But then the issue is, what are we leaving out? We need to be having those, we need to have discussions around, or rather we need to make sure that we are involving people at different levels. So it's the youths, the people at the grassroots. I think we had even touched on this during our previous discussion at the Kenyan mission, where we were saying that we need to make sure that we open up the collaborative spaces. It's one thing to sit at the United Nations and, you know, as leaders or as diplomats to sit in that room and talk about issues that are affecting people that are outside us. But then we're saying that we need to be realistic. And being realistic entails that we need to talk to people who are being affected. The young people are being affected. The people at the grassroots are being affected. Then the other issue is we are not starting from scratch, as we have said consistently. We are not starting from scratch. We already have existing structures and frameworks. But then the question is, how do we make sure that these existing structures are not hindering the agenda of going beyond GDP? We're talking about well-being. If what we're doing right now is hindering our measurements of well-being or measurements of ensuring that there's sustainability, then there's a big problem there. So we need to make sure that we're building on the existing frameworks, but we're building on existing frameworks that are working. So there's a lot of opportunity right now. I think, as you had said, it's an open door, a little space, but we can still push in. And there's a lot of political will. We have already seen, especially with the COVID-19 pandemic, now we have mpox. And there are so many issues. I mean, it's a public issue of concern, but at the end of the day, this is spreading, it's not waiting for anybody. And people are scared. That also impacts well-being. So is anybody measuring how scared I am about, you know, getting mpox or my family getting mpox? Nobody is measuring that. So we need to look at how we can sit down and agree on what form of measurements are we looking at. Because I've heard of so many measurements. And I can tell you, if you just go on the internet and search, you find there's a person talking about, oh, I found these measurements, oh, country A is doing this, country B is doing this. But how are we going to make sure that we measure it uniformly? I think GDP has taught us quite a lot of lessons in terms of having a standard, right? But then how do we come up with a standard of all these complementary measures that we're talking about and standards that will be agreeable to everybody? Because at the end of the day, we need a baseline that we'll be working from. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Joe. I think that's such a good segue into our open conversation now. Also on the point of unlearning and learning again. And I personally have to remind myself oftentimes that the let's say the more neoliberal system that we're in right now, which defines our economy, hasn't always been around forever. We tend to forget that, and that we can always, you know, also learn, I think, from it, to be very frank, from GDP, because truth to be told, GDP is a very, I mean, I guess there's a reason why it's been around now for some time and people stick to it, because there's a simplicity. And I think whatever comes has to also build on that experience in capturing the essence in such a simple way. As mentioned, we are running a bit of ahead of, sorry, we are running behind time, but that's also a sign of a good conversation. We have approximately 5 minutes for a conversation according to the schedule that we had. I mean, I'm looking at Lawrence. If Lawrence would sacrifice a couple of minutes from his, thank you so much, Lawrence, and we can have a bit more time, you know, for open questions to our distinguished speakers that came. I mean, to be fully transparent, you have had, or we have at least given you the opportunity to share with us questions beforehand. So I have some of them ahead of me. I won't be able to go into every single question at this point in time, but I will try to make the best in terms of, you know, getting the gist of it. And if you have more questions, please do chat, share them in the chat and that you have as part of Zoom. We will do our best to collect them. And if we can't respond to your questions today, we will do that after the session. So we will publish that on our website and also share with Rethinking that you can go and, you know, find some hints at it. And before I do that, I completely forgot, I'm so sorry, Lawrence, actually, to introduce Lawrence from Rethinking Economics. Lawrence is the Executive Director of Rethinking Economics International. He's a partner of the lab, as it is UNCTAD on this Youth Moving Beyond GDP initiative. He is for sure a big change maker and actually tackling the cause at the root, as Paula said before, looking at ways of changing how economics is thought. So having studied economics myself, I know how difficult it is, and Lawrence is working on that. So that's that. I would like to invite now everyone to join this conversation and share inputs that you might see relevant. So looking at what we have received before, there were actually, interesting enough, 4 clusters. I would like to mention them very briefly. One was really about measuring justice and human and planetary well-being. The other cluster was around the youth engagement aspect itself. The third cluster was around policy and systemic change on shifting perspectives. And then, last but not least, I think that's really probably what's also going to take us forward is how do we actually move beyond GDP in practice? So not only on the what, but really on the how. And I would like to start maybe with that. So how can we effectively transition to a beyond GDP framework that fosters collaboration among stakeholders in an inclusive way, that engages communities, right? Particularly at the local level, and also particularly those that have maybe not access to the format that we're offering today, because not everybody has access, you know, to internet and to digital. So that's a very interesting, I would say, question. Is there anyone who would like to speak to that? If so, please raise your hands and I will call you upon your... If no one raises the hand, then I will assign this question to someone. I'm just waiting for another 2 seconds.
Can you repeat it again? Because
Yes,
it was a very big question. I just need...
So the question was about the how, right? So how can we effectively transition actually to beyond GDP that fosters collaboration among stakeholders in an inclusive way? Kumi, thank you so much. Over to you.
Okay, so many of the conversations that are going now on systems change, and by the way, there's never been a moment in history that I'm from 45 years of activism that I've seen so many conversations about addressing such structural and systemic issues. But a lot of the design of those conversations, it's very unpeople-centric, right? Does not include people. So you end up then with sometimes good legislation, like say Obamacare on health in the United States, but the very beneficiaries of that actually are opposed to it because of the misinformation and disinformation and so on. So the main point I want to make, how do we do it, is not make this an elite conversation. If it's an elite conversation amongst mainly policymakers and so on, however good our conversations will be, they're not going to actually deliver. So it has to be, we have to find ways of educating people, making the conversation more accessible, opening doors for people to participate, use arts and culture to reach people. Don't only think of big words and big conferences. And the last thing I want to say to young people, especially in this context, you will hear people in my generation often saying, young people are the leaders of tomorrow, right? I want to urge you to push back against that, because my generation has run out of fresh ideas. And what we need from young people is the freshness of their lenses, right? The freshness of their perspective on the world. And if you wait for tomorrow to take leadership, there might not be a tomorrow for you to take leadership. So push back against that and take leadership now, because we are contaminated. My generation is contaminated by bad experience, and we can't actually think in a visionary way. And you need to bring freshness of your lenses to the conversation and include as many people is how we're going to get the change that we need. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kumi. And thank you for also pointing out this black spot and, you know, yeah, sort of the bias that I agree that generations have that have now the opportunity to change, but not much is happening. Rose, over to you. And maybe if I can just add one little thing, because that's another question that just came in that I think builds on this, is we talked about this expert panel, right? Giovanni, you mentioned that. Paula, you also mentioned that. One participant is asking, so how can we get young people on this panel concretely? Because that's a low-hanging fruit. Rose, over to you, and maybe then to Giovanni on that point as well.
Okay. Thank you, Kumi. I think that was very inspiring, and it's very nice to hear that as someone who's been in this for a long time, that you feel like there is something really happening around this conversation. And I think I agree with you so much in that it doesn't need to be an elite conversation in stiff offices where we sit in formal meetings. I think the more we can bring this out. I've been very inspired recently by citizen assemblies and ways of engaging people that are not, I think that's also the power of youth, because we are not yet representing a big organization, we're representing ourselves. Mm-hmm. And I've been so inspired by meeting people in the citizen assemblies. I was participating in one in Denmark, and just sitting with people from all generations around, not representing a corporate interest or some sort of business or anything, or even, an organization. They were just representing themselves as human beings. And I thought so many ideas and so many things sprung from those talks that would never have sprung up in another setting. So I think engaging people as citizens is a really crucial part of this. And then I also think we need to really think local solutions. I know that there's a lot of power in GDP as a universal standard, but I think it's also false. I think it's also part of the problem, because we need to engage people in local, deliberative, democratic ways to think about this, because this is how it will also fester and stay. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Rose. Yeah, it's not just top down, it's also bottom up. I fully agree. Giovanni,
yes,
over to you.
And then I wanted to actually follow very much on what Rose just said. I think it's important to engage both in the top level discussion, which may sound somewhat abstract to the general citizen, but also at local level. And I think it's particularly important because if you think about all what's at stake in transition to a low carbon economy, a lot of the action will have to happen at local level. Think of low carbon mobility, think about localizing SDGs, think about setting up a different system to effectively value the care economy. All these dimensions will entail a lot of local action. And I think it's important to keep that in mind. That offers a lot of spaces where I would believe the youth can play a critical role. That doesn't mean that the top level debates are not important, on the contrary. And I think that's one of the lessons that we need to take from the GDP experience. I mean, like you said earlier, if it's been around for so many years, and if it's more or less the yardstick for the standards of national accounting, there is a reason. And the reason has partly to do with the efforts that have been done to build it into the broader system of accounting. But at the same time, we need to keep reminding ourselves of these local spaces where it might be somewhat easier to act on some leverage point and experiment some of these changes that may go beyond also just quantifying things, but rather trying to experiment new solutions. To come to the issue of how to get a youth in the panel, as far as I remember, the call is of the UN Secretary General in terms of identifying which experts. But I think that could be a first step to involve more youth into this discussion and do it in a clear and concrete way.
Thank you so much, Giovanni. Actually, just maybe on that, this is also part of the efforts that we are working on together, actually, with UNCTAD, of finding ways of forming such a sounding board. So yeah, stay tuned on that. Briefly to Felix and then to Paula, and then unfortunately have to wrap up this round already. And again, we will be coming back to your questions in a written form because Lawrence is waiting and time is ticking. So Felix, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. I was thinking about the responsibility of the youth in these conversations and in a local level. And I think that we have some lessons regarding what we do at Rethinking Economics, that is at a local base in our universities. We have an important role because economic theory can play a very important role. I mean, it's easy to say GDP doesn't account for this, GDP doesn't account for that, but I think like the challenge is to coherently and systematically integrate non-market production in a greater theory. And like Kumi cited Einstein, we need to make progress in our economic theories, just like Einstein did, by moving from like mechanical physics into relativistic, I think that's the name, physics. And it sounds simple, but it's not simple. But like political economy is built on commodities like Smith, Ricardo, Marx, etc. So like instead of criticizing, we should also return to theory. And like, is it possible to think economics without commodities and goods as the only concept? I think it is, but it's also a theoretical challenge. So we have to change economics curricula, and at a local level, what we can do in our degrees in economic, in our curricula, sorry, it's huge. It's very important. We're trying to do that. I think we're going to do it. We are doing good, but I wanted to remark also the task that we have in our universities, spreading the word and fighting for a change in our curriculums.
Yeah, thank you thank you so much, Felix. I mean, I agree. Theory also shapes thinking, and thinking shapes action. So I think that's extremely important indeed. Paula, to you, and then I'll pass on to you, Lawrence, as soon as Paula is done.
Just briefly to add to the extremely rich conversation, I would say in addition to making sure that our economies sort of get out of this addiction to growth and to GDP growth in particular, I would highlight also the need to answer to the question on how, the need to address culture, the cultural shift that needs to happen. Just to give a very concrete example, in Spain, our GDP growth has been revised in the last few months several times upwards, and there has been research that has shown that GDP growth it is linked directly to people's perceptions of the economy. And so people's perceptions and also people's perceptions of their own well-being. And so when GDP growth is estimated lower than people's actual economic status, I would say, then that can get into, that can lead to problems such as disaffection, right, from politics in general, because they feel that the government isn't doing enough, or that those in power aren't helping them because their situation is worse. But when in reality, in Spain, it's been found that in reality the economic situation was better than it was previously assessed. So. And with this example, what I want to say is that there is also a connection that we need to break between, I guess I would call it sort of cultural norms or expectations and perceptions of well-being and the indicator GDP. And if we don't sever that connection, then we're going to end up reproducing the same problems.
Thank you so much, Paula. I think that builds on the mindset shift indeed. And I think that's a very good segue into Lawrence. I mean, I know we are actually officially done with time. So if you have to leave, please feel free to do that. But if you have another 5 minutes, I would really urge you to stay and listen to Lawrence. And then we will wrap up. Thank you.
Yes, I can somewhat feel your trepidation that you've not left me too much time to wrap up. But I'm not feeling too worried about that, because my role within this space is very much to give people like Rosa and Felix the space to talk, the space to give their views. And that's very much my role within our network, Rethinking Economics, where our broader role in changing economics education and the economy is to focus at universities and the theory and the practice that is there within the economics discipline. But this made me think a lot about what Kumi said, that we all have power. Every person has power in the world, and that means that all of us have a role to play. So my role very much is trying to ensure that we get youth voices into this conversation. I don't believe that if we change the sort of metric in how we measure the economy, that will change the economy, but it's one piece of the scaffolding that we need to change. We also need to change economics education at universities. We also need to change the way that we structure our economies. We need to think about the way that we create a more sustainable world. But GDP is part of that. GDP helps justify why growth is good. And it's one of the things that we need to really critically think about. So I'm really glad to be having this conversation, even if I've not got too long to speak. But what I think that kind of speaks to is that we actually need to have more of these conversations. We need to create more spaces where young people can actually bring forward their views, because as the essay competition showed, when we gave the deadline, I think it was 10 to 12 days, we got 600 essays of young people saying that they thought that GDP should change, and actually this is something that's really, really important to the next generation. So I guess for me, the feelings of the skepticism that have sort of come out, and maybe frustration, I mean, I think they're quite right. We've seen in the last few years there have been a lot of broken promises. We did not build back better, as what was talked about before. But I also can hear the hope in what people are saying, and actually there is a lot of momentum around this. There's been a lot of work to think through what a complementary measure would be. I am slightly worried that, from a little bit of what people have said, that there will not be an adequate youth voice in this discussion, but we're going to keep pushing for that, and so is the rest of our network. So yeah, so I guess the final thing to say is just a big thank you to everybody who's come and helped facilitate this conversation, who's brought Rethinking Economics and its network into this space. And I guess the action going forward is to ensure that we keep up this conversation and it doesn't just end here, and yeah, we move forward.
Thank you so much, Lawrence. I just wanted to echo what you said, also in terms of the Beyond Lab. This is exactly also why we're here for. We would like to be a space where these voices can be heard, where these voices can be part of. And as mentioned also before, we have been now looking into building the youth essay competition into an actual initiative on youth moving beyond GDP. So stay tuned on that, more to come. And one key element of that will be looking into ways of having a youth voice integrated into intergovernmental, at least, processes. That's one aspect, but also more again to come on that. And thank you for being honest. I think change happens, of course, if you push from it or for it through the perspective of me as an international civil servant. but also as someone that deeply cares. We need to care about it. I think Cholwe said it. The question is, how can we make other people care? And people care for different reasons, but we need to look into incentives, and that's what we're working on. And yeah, that's the end of this webinar. Thank you for your time, and we really hope to see you in the coming ones. You can see updates on our website. I assume also on Rethinking's website, and also Giovanni, I'm sure UNCTAD will be sharing that. And Kumi is back. I wanted to give you also special thanks, Kumi, because again, I know that you have been traveling, but really for setting the stage for challenging the system, because honestly, there is no other alternative. So thank you for that, and take care and goodbye. Thank you. Bye-bye.